I took this photo yesterday. An ordinary street, an empty road. But today, a person appeared in the picture. Tall, wearing a coat. He was standing where no one had been. And he was looking right at me. My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm a journalist. I don't believe in ghosts, aliens, or other nonsense. My work deals with facts. Hard evidence. Tangible reality. But this story made me question everything I thought I knew about what's real and what isn't. It all started with an assignment to investigate the disappearance of Mark Elliott, a high school English teacher from a small town called Pine Creek, Colorado. The case had been cold for nearly 3 weeks. No body, no leads, nothing but a strange statement from his wife. He said someone was watching him. Classic paranoia, I thought. The stuff of cheap thrillers. I drove into Pine Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, a place so small it barely registered on my GPS. Main Street consisted of a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and not much else. The surrounding mountains loomed over everything like silent guardians, trapping the town in their shadow. I checked into the Pinewood Motel, a single-story building with peeling paint and flickering neon. The kind of place where the sheets smell faintly of cigarettes no matter how many times they're washed. The desk clerk, a man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and thick glasses, handed me a key attached to a plastic tag marked with the number 8. "You're here about the Elliott case?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of concern. I nodded, unsurprised. News travels fast in small towns. "Strange business," he muttered, shaking his head. "Mark was a good man. Taught my grandson. Never missed a day of work until..." "Until what?" "Until he started acting strange. Jumpy. Like he was seeing things." The clerk leaned forward, lowering his voice. "People say it's the mountains. They play tricks on your mind if you stay here too long." I thanked him for the key and the unsolicited local folklore. My room was small but clean enough, with a bed that squeaked with every movement and a bathroom where the tap dripped in a slow, steady rhythm. I unpacked my laptop, notebook, and camera, the essential tools of my trade, and started planning my investigation. The next morning, I headed to the Elliott residence, a modest 2-story home on Spruce Avenue. Janet Elliott answered the door after my third knock. She was a slender woman in her early 40s with auburn hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Mrs. Elliott? I'm Daniel Hayes from the Denver Chronicle. I called yesterday about your husband's case." She nodded wearily and stepped aside to let me in. The house was immaculate, almost obsessively organized, as if cleaning had become her coping mechanism. "I've spoken to so many reporters and detectives," she said, leading me to a living room where family photos lined the walls. "They all ask the same questions, and none of them find anything. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps," I offered, taking a seat on the sofa. "Could you tell me about the days before Mark disappeared?" Janet sank into an armchair across from me, her fingers nervously playing with the wedding band she still wore. "It started about a month before he vanished," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious strain. "Mark was grading papers one evening when he suddenly looked up at the window. 'Did you see that?' he asked me. I hadn't seen anything. Just darkness outside. But he insisted someone was there, watching." "Did he describe who he saw?" "Not at first. He just said it was a figure, a shadow. I thought it might be one of his students playing a prank. But then..." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Then he started seeing this person everywhere. In shop windows, car mirrors, even in photographs." I jotted notes in my pad, maintaining a professional distance. This wasn't the first time I'd interviewed someone who'd lost a loved one to unexplained circumstances. People often created patterns where none existed, desperate to make sense of the senseless. "Did Mark take any photos of this figure?" I asked. Janet shook her head. He tried, but whenever he'd take his phone out, the figure would be gone. After a while, he started carrying an old Polaroid camera. Said digital cameras couldn't capture it. She gestured to a cardboard box on the coffee table. These were his. I leaned forward and opened the box. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photos, meticulously dated and labeled. Most were mundane, empty streets, the school parking lot, their backyard. Nothing unusual. Did the police look at these? They did. Janet's voice took on an edge of frustration. They said they couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Mark was so upset. He kept insisting the figure was there, clear as day. I flipped through the photos again, more carefully this time. In one of the last ones, dated 3 days before Mark's disappearance, I noticed something strange in the corner of the frame, a slight blur, possibly a camera defect or someone moving quickly out of shot. What about this one? I held it up. Janet's face went pale. That's the one that scared him the most. He said the figure was standing right there, staring at him. But I couldn't see anything. That night, he didn't sleep at all. He kept watching the windows, checking the locks. I slipped the photo into my pocket. Do you mind if I borrow this? She shrugged, defeated. Keep it. The police have copies. I changed tack. How was Mark in the days just before he disappeared? Did he say anything unusual, go anywhere out of the ordinary? Janet's eyes drifted to a framed photo of her and Mark on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so normal. He was terrified. Barely sleeping. He'd taken leave from school because he couldn't concentrate on teaching anymore. The day before he went missing, he told me he'd figured something out. What was it? He said the figure wasn't following him, it was waiting for him. He said it was always in the same places, standing under the same streetlight near Blackwood Trail. Her voice cracked. I begged him to see a doctor, but he was adamant this wasn't in his head. That night, he told me he was going to confront whatever it was. He left after dinner and never came back. I made a note of Blackwood Trail. And the police searched that area? With dogs, helicopters, volunteers. Nothing. Janet folded her hands in her lap, knuckles white. It's like he vanished into thin air. After promising to call if I discovered anything, I left the Elliott home, my mind buzzing with questions. Mark's disappearance had all the hallmarks of a man having a mental breakdown, seeing things, growing paranoid, eventually running away or worse. But something about Janet's account nagged at me. The precision of Mark's observations. The consistency of the figure appearing in specific places. My next stop was Pine Creek High School, a brick building dating back to the 1950s with an American flag fluttering limply in the breeze. The principal, Dr. Harriet Miller, had agreed to meet me during lunch period. She was a stern woman with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a tight bun, lips perpetually pursed as if tasting something sour. Mr. Elliott was one of our finest teachers, she said, sitting ramrod straight behind her desk. 20 years of service. Never a complaint. His students adored him. I understand he was acting strangely before his disappearance. Dr. Miller's expression tightened. We noticed changes in his behavior, yes. Mark had always been punctual, prepared, engaged. Then suddenly he was distracted, arriving late, jumping at shadows. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. 2 weeks before he disappeared, he interrupted his own lecture to stare out the window. When a student asked what he was looking at, he insisted there was a man watching the class. Several students took photos to prove no one was there. Did any of his colleagues notice anything unusual? You should speak with Diane Winters. She and Mark were close friends, taught in adjacent classrooms for years. I found Diane in the faculty lounge, a petite woman with cropped blonde hair and intelligent eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. She agreed to talk during her free period, and we walked the perimeter of the empty football field while students shouted and laughed in the distance. Mark was the most rational person I knew, she said, hugging her cardigan around herself despite the mild temperature. That's what made his behavior so disturbing. He wasn't the type to imagine things. What exactly did he tell you he was seeing? Diane hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if checking we were alone. A tall man in a dark coat. Mark said his face was wrong somehow. Blurred. As if someone had taken an eraser to it. She shivered visibly. He showed me photos where he said the figure appeared, but I couldn't see anything. It broke my heart to watch him unravel like that. Did he ever mention Blackwood Trail? A specific streetlight? Her eyes widened. Yes, actually. The week before he vanished, he was obsessed with that spot. Said the figure was always there at night, standing under the same light. He thought it was trying to communicate something. Did he say what? No, but... She hesitated again. The day he disappeared, he came to my classroom during lunch. He seemed almost excited, said he'd finally understood the pattern. He'd been keeping track of where and when the figure appeared, and he believed it was leading him somewhere. He promised to tell me everything the next day. Her voice cracked. That was the last time I saw him. As we completed our circuit of the field, Diane stopped and turned to me. Do you know what bothers me most about all this? Mark's phone was never found. Not in his car, not at home, not on Blackwood Trail. The police said he probably took it with him, wherever he went. But Mark was meticulous about charging his devices every night. If he'd had his phone, he would have called someone. Back at the motel, I spread my notes across the bed, trying to piece together a coherent narrative. The facts were these: a respected teacher begins seeing a mysterious figure that no one else can see. He grows increasingly obsessed, tracking the appearances, convinced the figure is trying to communicate. Then he disappears without a trace near a specific streetlight on Blackwood Trail. The simplest explanation was a mental health crisis. Perhaps Mark had suffered a psychotic break and wandered off, disoriented. But that didn't explain the missing phone or why his car was found neatly parked at the trailhead, locked, with no signs of struggle. As evening approached, I decided to visit Blackwood Trail myself. The area was at the edge of town, where civilization gave way to wilderness. A narrow path wound through dense pine forest, with only the occasional streetlight interrupting the gathering darkness. The trail was popular with hikers during the day but deserted now as shadows lengthened. I parked beside Mark's designated spot and started walking, my camera hanging around my neck. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of pine needles beneath my feet and the distant cry of a bird. About half a mile in, I found what I was looking for, an old-fashioned streetlight, its yellow glow creating a perfect circle of illumination in the deepening gloom. This must be the spot where Mark believed the figure always appeared. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish. There was nothing unusual about this place, nothing to suggest why it might be significant. Still, I raised my camera and took several photos of the empty space beneath the light, the surrounding trees, the trail stretching into darkness. The sun had fully set by the time I returned to my car. I sat there for a moment, gathering my thoughts. This story was beginning to feel like a dead end, a tragic case of mental illness rather than a mystery worth investigating. Maybe it was time to head back to Denver, pitch something else to my editor. With a sigh, I started the engine and drove back to the motel. After a disappointing dinner at the town's only diner, I returned to my room and connected my camera to my laptop, scrolling through the photos I'd taken that day. The images from Blackwood Trail were unremarkable: empty forest, the lone streetlight casting eerie shadows. I was about to close the file when something caught my eye in one of the last photos. I zoomed in, my heart suddenly racing. There, at the edge of the light's reach, stood a figure. A tall man in a dark coat. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The figure was still there, partially obscured by shadow, but unmistakably human in shape. I checked the timestamp, 8:43 p.m. I had taken that photo when the trail was completely deserted. I had been alone. I was certain of it. With trembling fingers, I enlarged the image further, trying to make out the figure's face. But where features should have been, there was only a blur, as if that part of the photo had been deliberately smudged. Exactly as Mark had described. I sat back, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps someone had been on the trail after all, hidden among the trees until I'd taken the photo. Maybe it was a shadow or a glitch in my camera's sensor. But deep down, I knew the truth. No one had been there. Sleep evaded me that night. I lay awake, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, my thoughts circling like vultures. Every creak of the old motel made me flinch. Twice I got up to check that my door was locked. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted into a fitful slumber, only to be jolted awake by my phone ringing at 6:30. It was Janet Elliott. "I found something," she said without preamble, her voice tight with urgency. Mark kept a journal. I just discovered it hidden under a loose floorboard in his study. "I'll be right there." 20 minutes later, I was sitting at the Elliott's kitchen table, a leather-bound notebook open before me. Mark's handwriting filled page after page, starting out neat and methodical before growing increasingly frantic and scattered towards the end. The journal confirmed everything Janet had told me. Mark had first noticed the figure about a month before his disappearance, initially dismissing it as his imagination. But as the sightings increased in frequency, he began documenting them systematically: date, time, location, duration. August 18, 7:15 p.m., reflection in classroom window, 30 seconds. August 20th, 9:22 p.m., rearview mirror while driving home, 45 seconds. August 23rd, 6:50 a.m., bathroom mirror, 10 seconds before disappearing when Janet entered. The entries grew more detailed and disturbed as weeks passed. September 4th, 10:15 p.m., Blackwood Trail streetlight. Stayed visible for nearly 5 minutes this time. Tried approaching but it vanished as I got within 20 feet. The face is still indistinct, but I'm convinced it's trying to communicate something. The way it stands, always oriented in the same direction, as if pointing. The final entry, dated the day of Mark's disappearance, sent a chill down my spine. September 15th, 6:30 p.m. I've figured it out. The figure isn't random, it's leading me somewhere. Every appearance, it's been oriented in the same direction, pointing deeper into the woods beyond Blackwood Trail. I've mapped the sightings and found the convergence point. There's an old mining tunnel there, abandoned decades ago. That's where I'll find answers. I'm going tonight. If I'm right, this will all make sense. If I'm wrong, I don't know what's real anymore. I looked up at Janet, who was watching me intently. "Did you show this to the police?" She nodded, wiping away a tear. "They searched the whole area, including the old mine. Found nothing. They think Mark wrote this when he was, not himself. That he wandered into the woods and got lost. But you don't believe that. Mark was an experienced hiker. He knew those woods. And he wouldn't just leave me without a word." I closed the journal, my mind racing. Is there a map of the old mining tunnels anywhere? The Historical Society might have something. They're in the old library building on Main. The Pine Creek Historical Society occupied a dusty room on the second floor of what had once been the town library. The elderly volunteer at the desk peered at me suspiciously when I inquired about mining maps. "Research project," I explained vaguely, flashing my press credentials. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a large tube. "These haven't been requested in years," she said, unrolling a set of yellowed blueprints on a reading table. The Silver Creek mine was operational from 1896 to 1954. mostly played out by the end. The maps showed an extensive network of tunnels cutting into the mountain behind Blackwood Trail. Most had collapsed or been sealed off when the mine closed, but a few remained accessible, primarily used by the occasional urban explorer or teenager looking for thrills. I took photos of the maps with my phone, thanked the volunteer, and headed back to my car. According to Mark's journal, the tunnel he'd been led to was located about 2 miles past the streetlight where I'd taken my photo. The smart thing would be to contact the police, share what I'd learned, and let them handle it. But something told me they wouldn't take me seriously. Not without concrete evidence. I spent the afternoon preparing for what increasingly felt like a foolish expedition. At the local hardware store, I purchased a heavy-duty flashlight, extra batteries, a compass, and a small first aid kit. I debated buying a gun but settled for a sturdy hunting knife instead. Back at the motel, I studied the mining maps and plotted the most direct route. According to Mark's journal, the tunnel entrance was partially hidden behind a rockfall, making it easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I transferred the coordinates to my phone's GPS, though I wasn't sure how reliable the signal would be in the dense forest. As dusk approached, I called my editor in Denver, telling him where I was going and promising to check in by morning. It was a basic safety precaution, though I felt ridiculous outlining the details of what sounded like a wild goose chase. He laughed it off as typical Hayes behavior, but agreed to alert authorities if he didn't hear from me by 9 a.m. I drove to Blackwood Trail just as twilight was fading. The forest looked different at night, more primeval, threatening. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the engulfing darkness as I made my way past the streetlight where I'd taken the photo. The trail gradually narrowed, becoming little more than a game path winding through increasingly dense undergrowth. Twice I had to check my GPS to ensure I was still heading in the right direction. The silence was absolute, not even the whisper of wind in the trees to keep me company. After about 40 minutes of hiking, I reached a steep incline where the path disappeared entirely. According to the map, the old tunnel entrance should be somewhere to my right, behind a jumble of fallen rocks. I swept my flashlight across the hillside, searching for any sign of human intervention in the natural landscape. At first, I saw nothing but trees and boulders. Then a glint of something metallic caught my light. Moving closer, I discovered a rusted metal spike driven into rock, an old mining marker. Following its direction, I scrambled up a short slope and found myself facing a narrow opening partially concealed by vegetation and collapsed stone. The entrance to the Silver Creek mine. Common sense told me to turn back, to return in daylight with proper equipment and preferably not alone. But I'd come this far. Taking a deep breath, I switched on my secondary backup light, secured it to my belt, and ducked into the opening. The tunnel beyond was surprisingly intact. Timber supports, blackened with age but still solid, held back the mountain above. The air was cool and damp, carrying the mineral smell of wet stone. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I advanced deeper, my flashlight beam bouncing off walls streaked with quartz and mica. According to the maps, this particular tunnel ran straight for about 100 yards before branching. I moved cautiously, alert for signs of instability or collapse. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady plink-plink that marked the seconds like a metronome. I had gone perhaps 50 yards when my flashlight illuminated something unexpected, a splash of bright color against the tunnel wall. Moving closer, I saw it was a plastic wrapper from a protein bar, relatively new. Someone had been here recently. Heart pounding, I pressed on, now scanning the ground for footprints. The tunnel floor was mostly dry packed earth and stone, but in a patch of sandy soil, I found what I was looking for, the clear imprint of a hiking boot, pointing deeper into the mountain. Mark had been here. The tunnel began to slope downward, the air growing colder and danker. My flashlight beam seemed to weaken, as if the darkness here was denser, more resistant. I checked the batteries, but they were still strong. Then I saw it, a faint glow ahead, too steady to be a reflection. Someone had left a light on in the depths of the abandoned mine. I approached cautiously, fighting the urge to call out. The glow emanated from a side chamber where the tunnel widened into what must have been a larger excavation area. As I reached the entrance to this space, I froze. In the center of the chamber stood a tripod with a camera, an old Polaroid. It was pointed at the far wall, where someone had pinned dozens of photographs in a precise grid pattern. And sitting cross-legged before this bizarre display, his back to me, was a man. "Mark?" I whispered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. The figure didn't move or acknowledge me in any way. He remained perfectly still, staring at the wall of photos. I took a step forward, my flashlight beam falling fully on the seated figure. It was indeed Mark Elliott. I recognized him from the photos in his home. But something was terribly wrong. Despite the cool air, he was dressed only in a t-shirt and jeans. His hair was matted, his posture unnaturally rigid. "Mr. Elliott? I'm a journalist investigating your disappearance. Your wife is worried sick." Still no response. Fighting a growing sense of dread, I circled around to see his face. What I saw made me stumble backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. Mark Elliott's eyes were open but unseeing, his face a mask of frozen terror. His skin had a grayish cast, his lips blue. I didn't need to check for a pulse to know he was dead, and had been for some time. With trembling hands, I raised my flashlight to examine the photo wall that had commanded his final attention. Each Polaroid showed the same thing, the tall figure in the dark coat, its face blurred beyond recognition. But in each successive photo, the figure was closer, larger, as if approaching the camera in incremental steps across time and space. And in the final photo, at the center of the display, the figure had reached the camera. The image showed nothing but darkness with two pale smudges where eyes should be. A sudden cold draft whispered through the chamber, making the photos flutter like the wings of trapped moths. My flashlight flickered, died, then came back dimmer than before. The backup light at my belt followed suit, plunging me into near darkness. In the feeble remaining glow, I saw my breath clouding before me, though moments ago the air hadn't been that cold. An overwhelming urge to flee gripped me, but I forced myself to take one last photo of the scene with my camera before backing away toward the tunnel entrance. I ran most of the way back, stumbling and cursing in the dark as my lights continued to weaken. When I finally burst out into the night air, the stars overhead seemed impossibly bright and beautiful. I called the police from my car, my voice shaking as I reported finding Mark Elliott's body. Within hours, the sleepy town of Pine Creek was swarming with law enforcement, local police, state troopers, even FBI agents interested in the mysterious circumstances of Mark's death. The official report eventually ruled it as exposure and dehydration. Mark had apparently become disoriented in the mine, unable to find his way out. The photo display was attributed to an extreme mental breakdown, a manifestation of his delusions. I returned to Denver the following week, my article about Mark's tragic end running on page 3. I included nothing about the figure in the photos or my own strange experience in the mine. Some things are better left unreported. But late at night, when I can't sleep, I find myself staring at my laptop screen, at the photo I took on Blackwood Trail. The tall figure under the streetlight. Looking at me. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of something in reflective surfaces, windows, mirrors, the screen of my phone. A tall silhouette. Waiting. I've started avoiding mirrors. Taking fewer photos. But I know it's only a matter of time before I see him clearly. Before he gets close enough. Last night, I drove past a streetlight and glanced in my rearview mirror. He was there, standing in the pool of light. And for the first time, I could almost make out his face. It looked like mine.